Now on BBC One, Songs of Praise with Pam Rhodes.
Well, this is actually Sir John's...
Tonight, Earl Spencer invites us to his family's private chapel, a Gothic treasure, as I continue my journey of discovery around the most beautiful churches. Early English, decorated, perpendicular, the three styles of the great age of Gothic architecture. This week, I'm going to be unlocking the doors to some of these late medieval treasure houses and finding out that there's more to them than meets the eye.
Churches were bigger and taller, reaching to heaven. Some churches were given spires. The pointed arch replaced the round arch. Pillars were narrower and more elegant. Windows were larger and filled with coloured stained glass. Churches were filled with light.
You have here 500 years of survival. It's quite exceptional to find a church with, in this case, 28 windows, all of which contain a large percentage of the original medieval glass. When it was first glazed and the people of Fairford came to see it, it must have seemed exotic and exciting and extraordinary, and it must have seemed like walking into the Bible. They depict everything from heaven to hell, from the birth of Christ to the Last Judgment. There are scenes here which are depicted in what's called the Poor Man's Bible, which was a bestseller in its day, and it was making accessible very complicated philosophical concepts drawn out by the placing of the images side by side. For example, you have up in the clerestory a battle going on between the defenders of the faith and the persecutors of the church. They had a code which is very easy to acquire. You can always recognize Christ because he has a cross on his halo, and he also wears a purple robe. You can always recognize the Virgin because she wears blue. And there are other ways of identifying saints. For example, St. James is always identified because he wears on his hat a cockle shell.
It's not until you get close up that you can see the detail in these windows.
And what remarkable detail it is too. The eyes are often picked out of a matte wash so that the light shines through them. Some of them are very alarming, I must say. Even though they are 500 years old, some of them looking back at you could have actually been somebody you looked at just in the tube or in the congregation.
We sit under stained glass windows in our churches every Sunday and hardly give them a look, do we? Are we missing a trick here?
I think we are. I think that they have always been inspirational, the way that glass uniquely paints colour with light, and it's still the only work of art that we require to keep the weather out.
In the studio, we've been conserving the 28 unique windows from Fairford Church, and our main enemy has been pollution, attacking both the external and the internal surfaces of the stained glass. The glass at Fairford is absolutely unique. It was a new period of design when the stained glass was being transformed into panel painting rather than mosaics, and this was the start of a new period in the design of stained glass. The medieval craftsmen used a tool called a grosing iron, and you can see an original nibbled edge of this glass. The tool was something similar to an old-fashioned glass cutter with a series of notches, and the glass would then be just gently nibbled until they achieved the desired shape. By looking at the glazier's glazed edges, we can reconstruct, almost like a jigsaw, the original designer's cut line. We're also, when we find a misplaced piece, moving it from one window where it shouldn't be to the window where it should be. So we're very fortunate in having some very good records from the past. We have this wonderful book by the Reverend Joyce, who did full-size tracings of the windows in the 19th century. And from his records, we can determine the glazier's original glazed edges and redraw the figures and the background as they should be. The craftsmen who created this and their techniques were absolutely fantastic.
St Bartholomew's is an early English church. Here lies the medieval tomb of Blanche Mortimer, Lady Grandison, who died childless in 1347. A sleeping beauty, eyes closed, hands clasping a rosary, gown draped over the edge of her tomb. At this time, women were always portrayed in death as being in their 30s, Christ's age at the resurrection.
Clergy and congregation were separated by screens, often intricately carved and painted. Wealthy people who gave money to the church sometimes had their own side chapels. Ceilings were sometimes made of stone, sometimes of timber. Walls were colored and decorated with images, though little remains today.
He's one of the, what I refer to as the morality stories. That sort of painting tended to come in towards the end of the medieval period, after the Black Death, when people were beginning to be more aware of the frailty of life and how you might not make it back to church next week, so just reminding them to behave well during the week and not risk being taken unawares.
But there's something on top of it, or is it underneath it?
Well, during the Reformation, when we became Church of England as opposed to owing allegiance to Rome, there was an order in council which said that popish idols and images should be obliterated. And this was when all imagery was supposed to be lime-washed over. People didn't like the plain white walls, so they painted texts from the newly translated Bible.
What would this church have looked like in its heyday in medieval times?
It would have been reasonably well decorated, but not with the Disney-type colours that a lot of people seem to think that it would have been, but more earth colours. And you'd have stories from the Bible, Old and New Testament. Up there we've got a rather splendid couple of series of passion cycles, rather like comic strips. And sometimes you had stories of the lives of saints, where you'd have the series of different tortures that a saint had gone through.
Now, one image that I do recognise, of course, is St. Christopher over there.
Yes, he's gorgeous, isn't he? He was a very popular saint in the Middle Ages because if you went on a perilous journey, you wanted to be able to see St. Christopher because this meant that you were safe for the rest of the day. And you usually get him opposite the main entrance to the church.
Just as I am without one plea, but that your blood was shed for me, and that you will me to be free, O Lamb of God, I come, I go. Just
When Diana, Princess of Wales, died in 1997, her family buried her within the boundaries of their Althorpe estate, a spot which for many has become a place almost of pilgrimage every summer, when the house and exhibition to celebrate her life are open to the public. A short distance away is Great Brinkton Church. The Spencer family's private chapel there houses one of the most remarkable sets of monuments in England.
The main church we see today has probably been here since the 14th century.
So what about the Spencers themselves? When did they arrive?
Well, we were sheep farmers locally, and then we moved into the park in 1486, so they've been living here since the beginning of the 16th century. Well, this is actually Sir John Spencer's tomb and his wife Isabel's, and this is the first of the 19 generations of Spencers who are buried in this chapel. And he had just moved to this new property in Northamptonshire, and he wanted to establish himself as the lord here, and that's probably why he built these tombs here. In those days, your death was to be a memorable event, and your life as well. So they never stinted, and so they would hire the most skilled sculptor of the day to perform the work of the tomb. Every single reference, the clothes they're wearing, all express different things. And also that I do know that angel there is meant to express the high moral quality of the couple. Also the coats of arms, just linking these people to past generations, so important in those days where, you know, your bloodline was considered such a fundamental part of your character.
So members of the Spencer family are still using their coat of arms today?
Yes, I mean, it's not something I sort of throw around too much. William's got his coat of arms from his mother's side entwined in his Prince of Wales ones. But that's the most modern example, and that's an adaptation. And Diana, when she was Princess of Wales, was very much a Spencer coat of arms with a Prince of Wales twist, whereas William's the other way around.
What about the hatchments on the ceiling? What can you learn from them?
Well, they're all Spencer ones, and they are the family coat of arms. What would happen in the day before newspapers? Say there was a death in the family, you would hang that at the front gate, and depending on which background was shaded in, you knew there had been a death in the female line or the male line of the family. So it was a case of warning your visitors, look, you're coming in at a very difficult time for the family, and just beware, we've had a disaster. I think death has become something that we're all almost frightened to talk about nowadays. And in those days, of course, when people had such truncated lives, it would be an everyday part of it, of your year, seeing somebody you knew die. So I think there's more of an element of celebration in the earlier tombs than there are today, where you just boldly state that so-and-so lived for so many years and they died and that's it.
So there are ashes here as well as actual bodies, are there?
There are now only ashes. My grandfather was a very tidy-minded man, and he went down there. You can see where the gateway is, and had a look and was really appalled at the state of some of the coffins, some 500 years old. He opened one, and there he said it was amazing to see a little red-headed Spencer man, about 5'2", completely preserved, and he sort of withered away once the coffin had been open. But the red hair was a strong trait. And then he had each one put in their own vase down there, and they're all in order. So I know exactly, I even know the shelf I'm going to go on. I will be the 20th generation to be here. In those chambers there, I will be for all eternity. But it doesn't bother me, it's quite nice to be with all your family after all.
My most vivid and broad impression of the identity of things seems to me to have been gained on a memorable, raw afternoon towards evening. At such a time, I found out for certain that this bleak place overgrown with nettles was the churchyard.
It's thought that the graveyard of this 13th century church was Charles Dickens' inspiration for the opening scene of his novel Great Expectations. And these tiny graves are now known far and wide as Pip's graves.
5 little stone lozenges, each about 1.5 feet long, sacred to the memory of 5 little brothers of mine, who gave up trying to get a living exceedingly early in that universal struggle.
I was born between 2 enormous Suffolk churches, Long Melford and Lavenham. When I was still a boy, I had this book which began to explain church architecture to me. And I would cycle around learning all sorts of things, but I found them very, very exciting to explore. And I suppose all my church concepts have developed since that period. Well, I'm not so often on a bicycle these days as I was when I was a boy, but I still love looking around churches and don't often miss one. I always look around the outside first.
When was it built?
It was built in the late 15th century, just before the Reformation. It was a well-to-do wool community making cloth, and the people who controlled it built the church. You can see all their names in the flintwork along the parapet.
So their wealth really is represented in the wealth of the
yes,
architecture.
That's right. And here we have a unique feature, which is a lady chapel, which is attached to the east end of the church. There's nothing quite like it in England. It's a great cult of the Virgin before the Reformation, and they built her this special house, really, a shrine. It's a beautiful building. And then later on, in the 18th century, they turned it into a school. Many of the village schools began in churches. And there's a multiplication table painted on the wall still. This is one of the greatest parish churches in England, built just before the Reformation. And I think the people who built it would be astonished if they came into it today and found it so bare. It would have been all glazed with painted glass, very dark and rich looking, and many altars around the walls with candles burning, and a big screen through which you could see the priest.
But do you feel that the spirit of this church has survived?
Oh, very much so. You see opposite, on the north wall, a great glass gallery of people who lived here in the Middle Ages, great people of Suffolk. Sir John Tenniel, who illustrated Alice in Wonderland, is said to have been influenced by the portraits. And you can see almost the ugly Duchess and the Red Queen in the windows with their butterfly headdresses. On the left of the altar, we have the Clopton Chapel, which is the private chapel of the people who helped to build the church. It's got a very rare piece of stained glass called the Lily Crucifix. And on the ceiling is painted a poem by John Lydgate, who's known as the Monk of Bury, called The Vine of Life.
They put an awful lot of love into the work that they did here, didn't they?
They employed the best craftsmen. They didn't call themselves artists, they called themselves glaziers and carpenters, but they were geniuses, really. And there was always this idea that everything was made for God. And they worked for God, really, in God's house.
The Reformation in the 16th century split the church in Western Europe forever, especially once Martin Luther had introduced the thought of translating the Bible from Latin into people's own language, and so suddenly faith was accessible to everybody. After the destruction in churches as lovely as this one at Long Melford, there was very little church building for the rest of the 16th century. And when it did resume again, it was short-lived because the 1640s saw the outbreak of the English Civil War. But that's another tale, and it's one I'll save for next week. And so until then, goodbye.
And next week's programme is earlier at 5 to 6 here on BBC One. The BBC's annual report is out now. For a free copy, call 08700 666 566 or log on to bbc.co.uk/info.
I think looking after 200 officers sounds hard. Try being a mother of two.
Getting respect from the young ones isn't easy, but it's easier than getting it at home.
With me.